Oftentimes when we think of school holidays, we are not too sure how to best utilize that time properly. Here in New South Wales, typically it's 2 weeks, unless it's the summer holidays between term 4 and the beginning of the next year for term 1, then it's even a longer holiday. So how do we best utilize our time so we're not really wasting it and we're still making sure that the student has enough time to rest up and has time to also work on the areas that they're academically potentially weaker in? Let's get into it. School holidays in Australia are quite generous, especially compared to other countries and different states and territories. What we do recognize is that after about 10 weeks of schooling, which is about 2.5 months, we get a 2-week break. And like I mentioned before, this break is even longer during the summer holidays. What we need to now recognize is how do we best utilize this time, because typically in those 2 weeks, we have some leisure activities, might have a combination of doing a little bit of school homework, also just chilling out and having some fun. However, with the recent lockdowns because of COVID-19, sometimes these holidays can be quite extended, and even though it's not really a school holiday, it kind of feels like a school holiday anyway, just because we are still learning from home. So it's quite tricky to make sure how do we best utilize our time so we're not really wasting it. Should they hang out with their friends, go to the park and play a game, do some sports, do some holiday classes, do family reunion, go on a family trip? The list goes on, and the possibilities are generally endless during these times. I think it really does depend on the student's goal and what you want to achieve. And this will really depend on each student and will differ between each student as well. For instance, if a student's educational goal is to not fall behind because from their school report, they recognize that they're doing okay, but in some areas that are a lot more weaker in compared to what they usually do, then they definitely need to spend a little bit more time so they don't really fall behind in that area. Especially with English and math, some of those things work on previously learned concepts. So if you don't understand a content or a topic that's taught in a previous term or a previous year, for instance, it's going to be really hard for you to learn the next topic because they build upon prior knowledge. So that's one instance. Or in another example, you're performing really well. So after the NAP plan, you know that you're in the top band in everything, or maybe you just completed studying for a long time and actually finished the New South Wales Selective exam. Then maybe the focus here is not really to catch up and do extra study just because you already did so much. I think the interim here is maybe during the whole school holiday and you have some time, maybe potentially you can allocate some time to just more recreation activities. It's time for you to rest up, recuperate your energy, because you don't have a lot of time until you get into high school. So the school holidays until then, just making sure you're not forgetting things, but the primary focus could be more centered on leisure. So it really does depend on the individual student and the individual goal. But in order for me to be as specific as possible to give you a proper example, I'm going to use a situation where a parent that we currently teach at Biggs Academy, they came up to me recently-ish, maybe 2 or 3 months ago, and they asked, for the school holidays, how do we best constructively use our time so that they have a good balance between academics and studying while making sure they have time to wind down and relax as well. So with this educational goal, it's a bit of a balance between the two. So we're not really leaning heavily towards one or the other. We're just doing a balance between the two, and I'll be breaking down what I think should be incorporated in this to make sure you're not really wasting your time during this. The first thing you want to do is to implement a timetable if you haven't already. A timetable is important even not in school holidays, but in school holidays, it's really, really important to kind of follow. The reason why I say this is because sometimes, and I'm sure if you're a student watching this, you might actually relate. I personally can. Well, sometimes after the school holidays, my friends ask me, how's your school holidays? And I just said, I don't know. It just went by really, really quickly. I don't even know what I really did. You don't want to be in that situation time and time again. Instead, try to implement a timetable, and it doesn't have to be activities to the dot. Something where it's like 8 a.m. you have to do this, 10 a.m. you have to do this, 2 p.m. and you have to do this, and so forth. No, it has to be a little bit more fluid than that. So just make sure that what are maybe the 2 or 3 things you really want to achieve in today. So for this instance, if you really want to go to the park with some of your friends in the local area, put park time, 11 to 2, okay, 11 a.m. to 2 o'clock. But when are you going to have to put your study time, right? Do you want to go and put some study time before you go to the park, after you go to the park, a combination of both, and you just put it in like that. You don't necessarily have to do it hour by hour, but it has to be kind of broadly speaking, that's probably the best place to do it. Since it's not strictly adhered to as well, where you're not allocating it, and if you don't follow it, you're punishing yourself, I think that gives a little bit more flexibility, because if something does happen, right? So if you're like, hey, something a little bit more spontaneous, if after the park they say, hey, let's get some ice cream, you don't just say, oh no, I have to study just because I put this in my timetable and I have to do that. Well, you can go eat the ice cream and maybe you can study even later that day, or you can do some extra tomorrow. But the objective here is you don't want to just sleep in all day, eat, sleep, and repeat. That's not what you want to do, because the time during the school holidays will fly by so quickly, and you will feel terrible about yourself if you didn't use it productively. The second point I would recommend is to include a leisure activity. I touched on this previously, but I think it's important to have a fairly good balance between study and having relaxation time. So, like I said before, you can go to the park or you can hang out with friends. But one thing I would like to encourage parents to do is to try to think of something that is just one event. I'm not asking for multiple. You can have multiple if you want, but just have one event that's a little bit more memorable, a little bit more significant, so that the child can actually remember it for times to come. So something like, post-lockdown or post-COVID and stuff like that, maybe you can just be going to a Luna Park, go to spend some time, go on the rides and just enjoy that. Or it could be a day at the zoo. So these are small activities which doesn't necessarily cost a lot, but it will be a profound impact for the child because they remember it, they have a lot of fun with it. And I think it's a really good talking point where after school holidays, when their friends are asking them, hey, how's the school holidays? They don't just say, I studied and went to the park. It could be awesome when they say, hey, I went to the zoo, my favorite part was looking at the monkeys or something like that. Or went to Luna Park and have you ever been to the Batman ride? Something like that will be really awesome for children, and it doesn't have to be multiple days. Those examples are just one day. 1 day out of 2 weeks, I think everyone can accommodate for that, and it's really not too much time to actually prepare for that as well. So parents, just keep that in mind. You need a healthy balance between the two, and if you need more leisure activity ideas, just let me know. I'm happy to provide some more suggestions. This is incredibly important because if they had nothing to do during the school holidays or nothing significant about it to share with others, it can actually have a negative impact on their self-esteem and confidence, and will also impact their marks as well. So number 3 is don't forget about study. And when I talk about study, I'm not talking about 6-hour day, you're locked in a room and you can't do anything else. If you don't finish studying, you can't do anything at all. I don't think that's practical, and it's not something that I did to get my marks. I don't suggest that any student or parent have to do that as well. What I do suggest though is just making sure that the student, if they're not used to studying usually, try to implement it and gradually introduce it into their daily lifestyle during the school holidays. So if they haven't studied usually before, maybe you can do half an hour in the morning and you could do half an hour later in the evening. Half an hour is not a lot of time, but when you're first starting out, half an hour can go a long way. If you think about the compound interest, half an hour a day, morning, half an hour in the afternoon, you have an hour. So that means during the weekday, for that school holiday week, you do 5 whole hours. And if you include both weeks of the school holiday, that's 10 hours, which is probably the number that you're kind of looking for. Obviously, that number will look even better when you're studying more than just an hour a day. A typical split that I would recommend is a little bit of study in the morning or generally before lunchtime. And this is the time when you're going through a new concept or a concept that they're already weak in. So in this instance, the parent says they didn't want their child to fall behind. So there must be areas that they're weaker in. So if they're weaker in fractions, I might introduce a new fractions, maybe a mixed fraction question, and introduce it to them there. And then after lunch or before evening, before dinner time, I get them to do more revision type questions. making sure that they're going over topics that they're pretty good at so they don't forget about it. While in the morning, when they're just woken up and the minds are a little bit more fresher, I would introduce something that they're really weak in, something they're not really interested in doing, but is quite important. I find that this works quite effectively for students even from year 2 onwards and upwards. So definitely give that a go. If you're younger than year 2, having 2 hours of study or 2 separate study blocks in the morning and the evening might be an issue. I would probably just stick with the one and try to make it as early in the day as possible and try to incentivize it with a leisure or recreational activity that they enjoy, or even it's just games. I think that could be fun as well. And the fourth and final tip that I would suggest to make sure you're not wasting time during the school holidays or during the lockdown is to change up your educational materials that you use and your approach. And what I mean by this is when we think back into just primary school or high school, typically they do standardized teaching. What does this actually mean? It means that every student in that class, since it's group classes, they have to learn the exact same material and topics. They have the exact same worksheets, the exact same things, and they can't really veer too much from that because everyone has to kind of learn at the same pace. So if you need more help in something, it's unfortunate because they can only provide a little bit of assistance before they're forced to kind of move on. For the school holidays, this is the chance for you to really focus and narrow down on those things and make sure that if you need some extra time on certain topics, you are given that time for it. You know, you're not necessarily, okay, I can only spend a day on this topic and you have to move on. If you need more time on that, then that's okay. An additional point in regards to this is you want to make sure that you're not just doing the same type of thing every single day, as that would be very stale and boring as well. If I was a student and I had to just work out pages from the exact same textbook every single day, I would have the lowest motivation because I'll be kind of bored from it. But if I were doing worksheets from a different book, some worksheets from an entirely different source as well, then I think that will be a lot more exciting. Personally, I just don't really like working from a textbook and only doing questions from that. I like being a little bit more interactive with the way that I learn and having a pretty good split as well. So if one day I'm learning reading in English, I want the next day to not be reading in English. I want that to be maybe math or science or something like that. I think that will spice up what I'm actually learning and just make it work out. But that's just my own opinion. I've taught students that don't actually like changing it up. They like to focus on the one topic and they only like moving on until when they fully grasp the fundamentals and they understand how to break down a lot of those questions. So they just keep going with that same textbook, with worksheets of that same topic. We don't even touch math or anything like that. We just focus specifically for that reading, if that's one area that they really want. So have a look introspectively, try to empathize what your child or student is currently feeling and how they actually do, because different students like to learn in different ways and it's very important to adapt. I can't give the same worksheets to one student to another student. They always have to be different because they have different strengths and weaknesses. In conclusion, I've gone over a couple of different strategies and ways that I will suggest in this particular example of a parent who's looking to better utilize their time properly for their child, especially when it's a bit of a balanced scenario. Obviously, if your goal is different, it might lean more one way more than the other. But in this instance, I think that's a pretty good balance where you might integrate a timetable, you have a mixture of a leisure activity, as well as having a study time set as well. If you enjoyed content like this, let me know down in the comments below, or if you had any additional questions that I didn't address, you can reach out at bingsacademy.com and I'll be more than happy to answer it. Thank you guys so much and I really appreciate it. Bye.